Kings and Queens, today we're diving into the most accurate game of chess I have ever played. Now, this game took place just a week ago at the Dutch Youth Chess Championships, and it was a very important game. Partly thanks to this game, I ended up with sharing the first place in this tournament, which ultimately qualifies me to represent the Netherlands later this year at the European Chess Championships held in Montenegro. So, let's see how I managed to win this game. So I decide to open up this game with the move e4, and now we get the move c6, the Caro-Kann defense. Now, here I decide to play d4 immediately, putting my pawns in the center, and we get the move d5. And now I decide to play the most principled line, which is e5. Yeah, there are many options like knight c3 and e takes on d5, which I've also employed in the past, but actually this game I decided to play e5, immediately getting space in the center. So it's really now on my opponent to show that he can diminish this strategic advantage. Now, before this game, I saw my opponent like to play the move c5, and here there are a couple of options for white. Yeah, this is the secondary line of the Caro-Kann, that move c5, and it has also been recommended many times by the legendary Levi Rosman, also known as Gotham Chess. Now here you can play the move knight f3, and when black takes, you can take with the queen, put the queen on f4, and the bishop on d3, starting a kingside attack. And there's also this option to take on c5 by the pawn, and just, yeah, you try to hang on to the pawn. But I knew my opponent was expecting this, so instead I decide to play the move c3. Now, by this move, I simply solidify the center, and now again, it's on my opponent to show that he has enough counterplay against my center to diminish my strategic advantage, right? So, my opponent decides to play knight c6, just developing his knight, and here, rather than playing the natural move knight f3, I decide to play the move bishop e2. Now, why do I do this? Because we are always taught to first bring out our knights, rather than our bishops. Well, if I were to play the move knight f3, now my opponent could take on d4, and yeah, when I take back, he can play bishop g4, and now my d-pawn becomes weak, because this knight defends the pawn, and yeah, let's say I kick that bishop, he could take here, and now y'all can see this pawn is hanging. So, I decide to play the move bishop to e2, preventing bishop g4, right, because now I can just take it. So, yeah, and here my opponent plays a bit of a strange move. Now, a normal move would be bishop f5, and now white could continue with a move like knight f3, and, well, now he doesn't have to move bishop g4, or when he plays it, at least he's lost a tempo, right, because now I have the bishop on e2. So, this is more standard play, but my opponent decides to play the move e6, and this is really not very smart, I suppose, because he just transposes into the French defense, but then with a tempo less. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's say, in the beginning, my opponent were to start with the move e6. The French defense, c5, c3, knight c6, and here, knight f3. Compare this position to what we are going to get once my opponent decides to play e6. Now you can see that I already have the bishop on e2, because he's played c6 and then c5 in the beginning of the game. So my opponent just mixed something up. I don't know why he did this. It's nothing to do about it. But yeah, here he decides to take on d4, and I decide to take back. We get knight e7, and now a very thematic move. Yeah, there are many moves here, like pawn to h4 even, you can just castle. But I decide to play knight a3, as when knight g7 was played, he blocked out his bishop. And, well, you may ask, like, why aren't you putting that knight on c3? I mean, putting the knight on the rim, it looks like it makes no sense. But when my opponent plays knight f5, which is also played in this game, I can play the move knight c2. And now I have, again, another piece that protects d4. So let's say queen b6 is played. Now my pawn isn't even hanging. So because this knight goes to c2, I can really just solidify the center. So that's why I prefer it on c2 rather than c3, which is also possible. Yes, okay, I play knight c2 obviously, and my opponent just decides to play bishop e7 because he wants to castle his king. And now here I start something smart. You see, my opponent wants to castle his king. I knew that. So I decided to play bishop d3, and rather than castling my king, I hold my cards. You see, here my opponent makes a very, very big blunder. A normal move like bishop d7 would have been better, after which I can just castle and we'll get a normal game. But, ladies and gentlemen, he decided to play the move short castles. And now, out of nowhere, bang, g4, I attack this knight. And if he goes back, I was gonna play rook g1 and simply swing off across this rook, and I almost have a winning advantage already. Let me show you what I'm meaning. Yeah, he plays move like bishop d7, I go rook g3, and eventually, after a couple of moves, you could bring the rook, and you can just see I have a raging attack, and it's pretty obvious that white is gonna win this game. So my opponent decides to play after g4 the move knight h4, and he still didn't see it. You see, I took, and now if I were to just play a normal move, I short castles. Sure, white is better, but it's not like a very big advantage or anything. But I had different plans. You see, here I decide to play the move g5, and this move gives up a pawn. But what it does is, it threatens queen h5, so I open up this queen, and yeah, I mean, any null move gets met with the move queen h5, attacking both the bishop and the h7 pawn, because, like, this is checkmate. So he'd have to play g6, blocking this, and then I take his bishop. So that's the point. So he has to take this pawn, because otherwise he loses the bishop, it's trapped. And now I decide to play queen h5. And again, he has only one way to guard both the bishop, which is attacked, and this pawn, which is attacked. He can do this by the move h6, which is also played in the game. And now I just play the move rook g1, and we get takes. And now it's really important for me to evaluate this position, because when I played g4 all the way back here, I saw this position. And the point is that, I mean, everyone can see I'm obviously down a pawn, right? But because I've opened up this file where the king is for black, I'm just already winning this game. Because, like, all these pieces are sleeping on the back rank, and I've got all my pieces developed except my king. So when my opponent plays king h8, simply stepping out of the way of the rook, because if he were to make a null move, I'd take on h6, and this is hanging because he can't take, because then he would hang his king. So my opponent plays king h8. I decide to play king e2, further styling on my opponent. No, the point is that I'm now threatening rook takes g7. So if he were to make a null move, I could take here, and this will not end well, because this is obviously a checkmate. And if he were to put his queen on g5, I can simply take it, and this is also a checkmate. So, also this move f5, by the way, you can also sack the rook, and when he takes back, you can check, and, oh, mouse slip, you can take, and also this is just winning for white, because like this is +5, it's completely losing. I mean, he does have 2 rooks for the queen, but it's just that all his pieces aren't developed, so he can just not survive this attack, and I have a passed pawn, so I'm just gonna push it up the board and I'm gonna queen, and this will win me the game. So my opponent decides to play king h8, king e2, and rook g8. Yeah, he plays that move to guard g7, right? Because now if I sack the rook, he can just take back, and this is not what I'm trying to do. So, yeah, here I decide to play queen takes f7. And I take the pawn, right? Now, if my opponent just does nothing, I'll go queen g6, and this is checkmate. If he were to play queen e8, trying to trade the queen, a very logical move, I would take on g7, and if he takes here, I take the queen, and if he takes here, I can just take here. So, then I'd be up a pawn. So my opponent decides to play knight e7, and this gives me the opportunity to again sacrifice my rook with rook g6. Now, first of all, if he takes, again, this will be a checkmate because the king can't move, and uh, this is just checkmate. Like there's nothing to stop this. It's just mate in one, so he cannot take. And you may be wondering, well, what about this move queen e8 now to trade the queen? Well, you can actually still take on g7 as well, but even more fancy is to just take on h6. And now it's checkmate. So this is what I was hoping for, obviously, but my opponent does play the move knight f5, blocking this attack. So now I take this knight. And I do this because now after the move rook g1, g7 is undefendable. So now I'm just crashing through on the king side, and I'm gonna win a pawn. And also this knight is way better than this bishop because it's looking at all his own pawns, right? Like all these pawns are on light squares and he has a light square bishop, so it's bad. So I play rook g1, and yeah, he can't defend this, so he plays queen f8. Because any other move just gets met with rook g7, and that's checkmate. So queen f8, and I decide to take on f8 and take on g7. And now I'm just up a pawn, and I just have a very clearly winning position, but I do get one more chance to also sacrifice something later in this game. Yeah, he plays f4, and he wants to open up this bishop, right? So I play knight b4, and I'm attacking this pawn. I just want to take it. It's very simple. And if you were to play bishop e6 guarding, I can go like, yeah, rook g6, attacking both, and now he's cooked. So my opponent decides to play rook d8. And well, now, again, any move wins in this position, doesn't really matter, but I decide to take on d5 as it is the cleanest. Because this rook really isn't even defending the pawn, because this is checkmate also. So, like he's getting completely destroyed here. And now he just plays the move h5. You know, desperately he's trying to disconnect my pieces. So let me explain what I'm talking about. If I were to play a move like a3, just wasting a move, he could check here, and now if I move the king or something, he can take the rook. And yeah, I'd have to sack the rook, and that's not what I'm trying to do. So after h5, I decide to play the move knight f6. So my opponent naturally plays the move bishop g4. And now after the move rook 1 takes g4, my opponent decides to resign the game as there is nothing left to be done here. Yeah, if he were to take back, this is checkmate. So this is my greatest game.